She was supposed to be dead 2 days ago. So why is there a dog refusing to leave her side? The night security camera flickered under the dim yellow lights of the old enclosure, capturing something no one was meant to see, something that didn't make sense, something that would later leave every staff member standing in silence with tears in their eyes, because right there on the cold concrete floor, where an albino gorilla named Luna had been left alone without hope, without care, without even the expectation of survival, there was movement, not from her, but from something curled tightly against her fragile body. A dog, a stray no one had ever seen before, pressed close as if guarding a secret the rest of the world had already given up on. And yet just hours earlier, Luna hadn't moved at all, not a breath noticeable, not a flicker of life in her pale eyes, the kind of stillness that made even the most experienced staff quietly accept what was coming next, because Luna had been declining for weeks, her rare condition making her weaker by the day, her appetite gone, her strength fading, her once curious gaze replaced by a distant emptiness that no amount of routine checks or minimal care could reverse. And in a place already struggling to stay open, where resources were stretched thin and difficult decisions were made behind closed doors, Luna had become the kind of case no one wanted to talk about out loud, the kind that slowly slipped into the background until silence felt easier than action, until waiting felt easier than trying, until everyone convinced themselves there was nothing left to do. And so her enclosure had grown quieter, colder, more forgotten with each passing night, until even the sounds of the other animals seemed to fade around her, as if the world itself had begun to move on. But then, just before midnight, something changed. A shadow appeared along the fence line, slipping through a gap that shouldn't have been there, moving cautiously, deliberately, like it knew exactly where it was going. And for a moment the cameras almost missed it. Just another stray passing by, just another night blending into the next, until the figure stopped, turned, and stepped fully into the enclosure, revealing a medium-sized dog with a worn coat and steady eyes, not frantic, not lost, but focused. And instead of searching for food or trying to escape, it walked straight toward Luna, slow, careful steps across the cold ground, closing the distance between life and what should have been the end. And when it finally reached her, it didn't hesitate, it didn't circle, it didn't bark. It simply lowered itself beside her, pressing its body against hers. As if that had always been the plan, as if this moment had been waiting to happen. And for the first time in nearly 48 hours, something shifted, so subtle it almost went unnoticed. A faint movement beneath Luna's stillness, a breath, barely there, but real, and the dog didn't move, didn't leave, didn't even look away, as if it knew something no one else did, as if it was holding on to a truth the rest of the world had already abandoned. By the time the morning shift arrived, the cold air still hung heavy over the enclosure, but something about the scene felt different, subtle yet undeniable, as if the silence that had once surrounded Luna had been replaced by a quiet tension that no one could quite explain. And when Daniel Brooks pushed open the service gate with his usual routine in mind, clipboard in hand and expectations already set low, he stopped mid-step, his breath catching not from fear but from confusion, because there, right where Luna had been lying motionless the night before, was a shape he did not recognize, a dog, curled tightly against her pale form, its body rising and falling slowly as if it had been there for hours, maybe longer. And for a moment Daniel just stood there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, because no animal was supposed to be inside that enclosure, especially not a stray. And yet the dog did not react to his presence the way most would. It did not bolt, did not growl, did not even lift its head right away. Instead it stayed pressed against Luna, as if its only purpose was to remain exactly where it was. And that was when Daniel noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. Luna's chest, it moved. Again, faint but real, a slow, fragile breath that should not have been there, not after everything he had seen over the past 2 days, not after the stillness that had convinced everyone she was slipping away. And suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, as Daniel stepped closer, careful not to startle the dog, his boots echoing softly against the concrete, each step filled with hesitation because none of this made sense, not the dog, not the timing, not the fact that Luna, who had not responded to any form of care, was now showing the smallest sign of life. And as he crouched a few feet away, the dog finally lifted its head, locking eyes with him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something that felt almost deliberate, almost knowing, as if it understood the weight of the moment, as if it was silently asking him not to interfere. And Daniel froze, caught between protocol and instinct. Because protocol said to remove the stray immediately, to secure the enclosure, to restore order, but instinct told him to wait, to watch, to not break whatever fragile connection had formed in the darkness of the night. And so he stayed there, longer than he should have, observing the way the dog gently adjusted its position, pressing closer to Luna, the way Luna's fingers twitched slightly against the ground, the way her breathing, though still weak, began to find a rhythm that had been missing for days. And something inside Daniel shifted, a realization he was not ready to voice yet, that maybe what he was witnessing was not random, not accidental, but something deeper, something that had found its way into a place where hope had already been written off. And as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting a soft glow across the enclosure, Daniel slowly reached for his radio, his voice quieter than usual as he called for Dr. Emily Carter, unsure of how to explain what he was seeing, but certain that whatever was happening here could not be ignored, because somehow, against every expectation, Luna was still holding on, and the only thing that had changed was the presence of a dog that refused to leave her side. Dr. Emily Carter arrived faster than usual, her steps quick and focused as she moved through the corridor with a sense of urgency Daniel had rarely seen before. And when she stepped inside the enclosure, her eyes immediately went to Luna, then to the dog, then back to Luna again, as if trying to confirm that what she was seeing was real and not just a misinterpretation of hope. Because only 48 hours earlier she had quietly told the staff to prepare for the worst, that Luna's condition had reached a point where recovery was no longer expected. And yet now there was movement, faint but undeniable, a fragile rhythm in Luna's breathing that should not have returned on its own. And for a moment Emily said nothing, kneeling down slowly a few feet away, careful not to disturb the scene, her trained eyes scanning every detail, the position of Luna's body, the subtle tension in her fingers, the way her chest rose just enough to prove she was still fighting. And then her attention shifted fully to the dog, who remained pressed against Luna with unwavering stillness, its body acting like a barrier between her and the cold ground, its presence calm, almost intentional. And Emily narrowed her eyes slightly, not in suspicion but in deep concentration, because something about this behavior did not match what she would expect from a stray, not the lack of fear, not the steady breathing, not the refusal to leave even when two humans were now standing within a few feet. And as if sensing her attention, the dog slowly lifted its head again, meeting her gaze with the same quiet intensity Daniel had noticed earlier. And for a second it felt like time paused, like there was an understanding passing between them that words could not explain. And Emily found herself hesitating, something she almost never did, because every instinct in her training said to proceed, to examine Luna, to intervene, but another instinct, something deeper, told her that whatever was happening here had already begun without them, and disrupting it too soon might break something fragile that they did not yet understand. So instead she adjusted her approach, speaking softly, her voice calm and steady as she addressed the dog as if it could understand, as if acknowledging its role in this moment mattered. And slowly, carefully, she extended her hand just slightly, not to touch, not yet, but to signal that she meant no harm. And the dog did not move away, did not tense, did not react with fear. It simply watched her, then turned its head slightly back toward Luna, pressing closer again. And that was when Emily noticed something else, something that made her inhale sharply. Luna's fingers, they moved again, this time more clearly, a small but deliberate motion, as if responding to the warmth beside her, as if recognizing that she was not alone. And Daniel felt it too, that shift in the air, that quiet realization that this was no longer just a waiting period. This was something else entirely, something active, something changing in real time. And Emily quickly but gently reached for her medical kit, still moving with caution, still careful not to startle the dog, because now her priority had shifted, not from following protocol, but from understanding the connection unfolding right in front of her. And as she prepared to check Luna's vitals, she spoke quietly to Daniel, her voice low but filled with something he had not heard from her in days. Not doubt, not certainty, but something in between, something like hope. And as the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the enclosure more fully, it became impossible to ignore what they were witnessing, because against every expectation, against every logical outcome, Luna was not fading anymore. She was holding on, and the only constant, the only change, was the dog that refused to leave her side, as if it had been waiting for this moment long before anyone else realized it mattered. The decision was made faster than anyone expected, and it was the kind of decision that usually came with certainty, but this time it carried hesitation, because as Dr. Emily Carter carefully placed her stethoscope near Luna's chest, listening closely to the faint rhythm that had returned against all odds, the rest of the staff began to gather just outside the enclosure, their voices low, their expressions uncertain, and the question was no longer whether Luna was still alive, but what to do next, because the presence of the dog complicated everything. It broke protocol, it introduced risk, and in a facility already struggling to maintain order, risk was something they were trained to eliminate immediately, and yet no one stepped forward to remove it, not after what they had just witnessed, not after seeing Luna respond for the first time in days. And Daniel felt that tension more than anyone, standing between the expectations of the system and the quiet reality unfolding in front of him, because he knew what the rules said, but he also knew what he had seen, and those two things did not align. And as one of the supervisors spoke up, suggesting that the dog should be removed right away before it caused further complications, there was a pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to reveal doubt, and Emily looked up, her eyes steady but thoughtful, not dismissing the concern, but not agreeing either, because something about this situation did not fit into the usual categories of right or wrong, safe or unsafe. And instead of giving a direct answer, she turned her attention back to Luna, observing the slight increase in her breathing, the subtle movement in her hands, the way her body no longer seemed completely withdrawn. And then she spoke, her voice calm but firm, suggesting that they wait, just for a little while longer, because whatever was happening here was already influencing Luna in a way nothing else had, and removing the dog too soon might undo it. And that idea, as uncertain as it was, began to settle into the minds of those listening, not as a solution, but as a possibility they could not ignore. And so the decision shifted, not officially, not in writing, but in action, as they chose to observe instead of intervene, to watch instead of control. And that choice changed everything, because over the next hour, something continued to unfold. Slowly but unmistakably, Luna's breathing grew steadier, her body less rigid, her fingers twitching more frequently as if trying to reconnect with something beyond the silence she had been trapped in, and the dog remained exactly where it was, adjusting only slightly to stay close, to maintain contact, to provide warmth in a way no artificial source could replicate. And at one point, when Emily moved just a little closer to check Luna's pulse, the dog shifted its position, not aggressively, not defensively, but deliberately, placing itself between her hand and Luna's body for just a second, as if setting a boundary, as if asking for patience. And Emily stopped immediately, pulling her hand back, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because in that moment, it became clear that this was not random behavior. This was intentional. And whether or not they could explain it did not matter as much as the effect it was having. And Daniel noticed it too, the way the dog seemed to anticipate movement, the way it stayed alert without appearing anxious, the way it never once attempted to leave even though the gate remained partially open. And slowly, a new realization began to take shape, one that none of them were ready to say out loud yet, that maybe the dog was not just helping Luna survive. Maybe it was the reason she had not given up completely. And as the morning stretched on and the light filled the enclosure, the situation that once seemed hopeless now stood on the edge of something entirely different, something fragile, something uncertain, but something alive. And for the first time in days, no one was talking about the end. They were watching for what might come next. By mid-morning, the enclosure no longer felt like a place waiting for an ending, but no one could explain why, because nothing about the situation had changed in any official way. Luna was still weak, still fragile, still lying on the same cold surface she had not moved from in days. And yet the atmosphere had shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if something invisible had begun to push back against what everyone had already accepted, and the staff felt it, even if they did not say it out loud. Even as they continued their routines just outside the gate, glancing in more often than usual, watching longer than they intended, because inside, the dog had not moved far from Luna's side, only adjusting slightly as the hours passed, maintaining contact as if it understood that distance was not an option, and every small change in Luna seemed to happen only when that connection remained unbroken, her breathing now steady enough to count, her fingers curling faintly against the concrete, her eyelids trembling just enough to suggest awareness rather than absence. And Dr. Emily Carter noticed every detail, documenting quietly, not because she was certain of what it meant, but because she knew it mattered, and as she crouched nearby again, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance, she began to piece together something that did not fit any textbook explanation, because the improvement, as slight as it was, did not align with any treatment they had given. There had been no new medication, no intervention, no change in environment except one, the presence of the dog, and that realization began to settle deeper with each passing minute, raising questions that no one could answer yet, but could no longer ignore, and Daniel saw it too, the pattern forming in real time. The way Luna's condition seemed tied to something beyond physical care, something that responded not to procedures, but to presence, and it made him hesitate every time he thought about what they were supposed to do next, because the longer the dog stayed, the more it became clear that removing it might not just restore order, it might take something away that Luna needed to keep going, and that thought was enough to hold him back, even as others began to question how long they could allow this to continue, because the situation was still unpredictable, still outside their control, and control was something they relied on, especially in a place like this. But control had not helped Luna before, and now something else was, something simple, something quiet, something no one had planned. And then, just as the tension began to build again, something happened that shifted everything further. Luna moved, not just a twitch, not just a reflex, but a slow, deliberate motion, her hand lifting slightly off the ground before resting gently against the dog's side. And for a second, no one spoke, no one moved, because that single action carried more weight than anything they had seen so far. It was not just a sign of life, it was a response, a connection, and the dog reacted immediately, not with excitement, not with sudden movement, but with a calm adjustment, leaning into her touch as if acknowledging it, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. And Daniel felt something tighten in his chest as he watched, because in that instant, the uncertainty they had been holding on to began to take shape into something clearer, something harder to dismiss, that this was not coincidence, not chance, but something real unfolding right in front of them, something that did not need explanation to be understood. And as the silence settled again, heavier but somehow more hopeful, one thing became impossible to ignore. Luna was no longer alone in her fight, and whatever this connection was, it was only just beginning to reveal what it could do. It happened just after noon, in a moment so quiet that it almost passed unnoticed, but it changed everything, because as Dr. Emily Carter leaned in once more to check Luna's breathing, preparing herself for slow progress at best, Luna's eyes opened, not fully, not with strength, but enough to reveal awareness, enough to show that she was no longer lost somewhere beyond reach, and the effect was immediate. Daniel stepped forward without thinking. The staff outside the enclosure went silent, and even Emily froze for a fraction of a second before regaining her focus, because this was the moment none of them had expected to see again, not this soon, not after everything that had pointed toward the end, and Luna did not move much beyond that, her body still weak, her limbs heavy, but her eyes, pale and unfocused at first, slowly shifted, searching, adjusting to the light, until they settled on the one presence that had not left her side, the dog, and something passed between them in that instant, something subtle but undeniable, because Luna's breathing changed again, not just steady now, but slightly deeper, as if her body had found a reason to keep going, and the dog responded in kind, lifting its head, meeting her gaze, and then gently pressing closer once more, its movements careful, deliberate, almost protective, and Emily felt it, that shift from observation to realization, because this was no longer just a strange coincidence. This was a connection, something forming in real time that could not be explained by training or instinct alone. And as she carefully reached out again, slower this time, giving the dog time to react, something unexpected happened. The dog did not block her, did not move to stop her hand. Instead, it stepped slightly aside, just enough to allow access, but not enough to break contact with Luna, as if it understood that help was needed, as if it was choosing to trust. And Emily paused, recognizing the significance of that moment before proceeding, gently placing her hand near Luna's neck to feel her pulse. And it was there, stronger than before, still fragile, but present in a way it had not been earlier that morning. And Daniel exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath, because now there was no denying it. Luna was coming back, not quickly, not completely, but undeniably. And the only constant through all of it was the dog, whose presence had not wavered even once. And as Emily began giving quiet instructions to bring water, to prepare a light nutritional solution, to adjust the plan from passive observation to cautious support, the entire atmosphere shifted again, not into chaos, but into careful movement, controlled urgency guided by something new, something fragile but real, hope. And yet, even as the team began to act, one question lingered in Daniel's mind, one detail that refused to settle, because as he watched the dog closely, the way it moved, the way it stayed focused on Luna and nothing else, the way it seemed to anticipate each shift in her condition, he could not shake the feeling that this was not the first time it had seen her, not the first time it had chosen to stay. And that thought, quiet but persistent, began to take shape into something deeper, something that suggested this moment was not random at all, but part of a story that had started long before any of them realized they were witnessing it unfold. The realization did not arrive all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, in the quiet moments between action and observation. As Luna continued to respond in ways no one had predicted, her breathing now steady enough to support small sips of water, her eyes opening more frequently, staying focused longer each time, and every improvement seemed to happen only when the dog remained close, as if the connection between them was not just emotional, but essential, and Daniel could not ignore it anymore. The pattern was too clear, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and as he stood just outside the enclosure, watching the way Luna's gaze followed the dog whenever it shifted even slightly, he felt a growing certainty that there was something more behind this, something they had not yet uncovered. And it pushed him to ask a question he had been holding back since morning, a simple one at first, directed toward the other staff, asking if anyone had ever seen this dog before, if it had been around the facility, if it belonged to someone nearby. But the answers came back, the same, uncertain, vague. No one recognized it. No one had noticed it before, and that only deepened the mystery, because the dog's behavior did not match that of a stray wandering in by chance. It moved with purpose. It stayed with intention, and it showed no interest in leaving even when food was placed just a few feet away, barely glancing at it before returning its focus entirely to Luna. And that was when something else surfaced, a memory from one of the older staff members who had been quiet until now, standing near the back, listening more than speaking. And when he finally stepped forward, his voice hesitant at first, it carried a detail that shifted everything. He mentioned a former caretaker, someone who had worked closely with Luna months ago, someone who had spent long hours by her side during an earlier period when she had shown signs of weakness, someone who had been known for bringing a dog to the facility, a dog that would wait patiently outside the enclosure during shifts, never entering, but always nearby. And Daniel turned sharply, his attention locking onto that detail, because it connected too many things at once to ignore, and he asked for more, pressing for a name, a timeline, anything that could confirm what he was beginning to suspect. And the answer came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the memory itself carried weight. The caretaker had left unexpectedly, personal reasons no one had fully explained, and after that, the dog had not been seen again, until now. And the moment that realization settled, Daniel looked back into the enclosure, his eyes moving from Luna to the dog, studying it more closely, noticing the calm focus, the familiarity in its posture, The way it stayed close not out of fear, but out of recognition, and everything began to align, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to form a picture that made more sense than anything else they had considered. And as if responding to that unspoken connection, Luna shifted again, this time lifting her hand slightly higher, resting it more firmly against the dog's side, and the dog leaned in without hesitation, closing the gap between them as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. And Emily saw it too, the way their movements synchronized, the way the interaction felt less like coincidence and more like reunion. And for the first time, the room filled not just with cautious hope, but with something deeper, something that carried emotion none of them were prepared for. Because if what they were beginning to understand was true, then this was not just a random act of compassion. This was something returning, something unfinished finding its way back, and Luna, who had been left alone to fade, was no longer just surviving. She was responding to something she remembered, something she recognized, something that had not forgotten her even when everyone else had started to let go. By late afternoon, the entire facility had slowed down in a way no one had planned, as if every routine, every schedule, every expectation had quietly shifted around the single enclosure where Luna and the dog remained side by side. Because what had started as confusion had now turned into something far more powerful, something no one could ignore anymore. And as Dr. Emily Carter carefully introduced a small portion of diluted nutrition using a soft feeding tool, Luna responded. Again, weak but willing, her body no longer resisting, her movements slow but intentional, and each time she accepted even the smallest amount, the dog stayed close, watching, adjusting its position just enough to remain in contact, as if ensuring that whatever connection had brought her back was never broken. And Daniel stood nearby, no longer questioning whether the dog should be removed. That conversation had faded hours ago, replaced by something else entirely, a shared understanding that this presence was not a disruption, but a part of the process. And as more staff members gathered quietly at a distance, their earlier skepticism replaced by silent observation, the story that had begun to form in pieces now felt undeniable, because the older staff member who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, this time more certain, recalling more details, explaining that the former caretaker, a man named Aaron Cole, had spent months building trust with Luna during a previous decline. Speaking to her, sitting near her enclosure for hours, and always accompanied by his dog, a calm, steady companion who never barked, never caused trouble, but always stayed close. And as those memories were spoken out loud, the connection became clearer, not just for Daniel, not just for Emily, but for everyone listening, because the dog in front of them matched that description too closely to ignore. The same calm presence, the same focus, the same refusal to leave, and it changed the way they saw everything. Because this was no longer a random act. This was continuity, something returning to finish what had been left incomplete. And as if to confirm it in the only way she could, Luna moved again, this time lifting her head slightly, her eyes opening wider, searching, and when they settled on the dog, there was no hesitation, no confusion, just recognition, and the reaction was immediate. Her breathing deepened, her fingers curled more firmly against its side, and the dog responded by gently shifting closer, pressing its body against hers in a way that felt almost familiar, almost practiced, and Emily felt her throat tighten as she watched, because in all her years of training, all her experience with recovery and decline, she had never seen anything like this, not a response driven by medication or intervention, but by presence, by memory, by something that existed beyond what they could measure. And as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the enclosure, the space that had once felt like an ending now carried something entirely different, something fragile but undeniable, a beginning. And for the first time since Luna had been left to fade, no one was preparing for loss anymore. They were witnessing something return, something rebuild itself in the quietest, most unexpected way. And at the center of it all, the dog remained exactly where it had been from the start, steady, patient, as if it had known all along that this moment would come, and that it would not leave until it did. The next morning did not feel like a continuation. It felt like something entirely new had begun, because when Daniel unlocked the enclosure gate just after sunrise, He was no longer stepping into a place defined by silence and waiting. He was stepping into a space that now held quiet movement, steady breathing, and something far more powerful than any plan they had written down. And Luna was no longer lying completely still. Her body still weak, but no longer withdrawn. Her eyes opened more often, then closed, following the dog with a clarity that made it impossible to deny what had happened overnight. And as Dr. Emily Carter entered behind him, carrying a small tray with carefully measured food and water, she paused for just a second, taking in the scene not as a professional assessing a case, but as someone witnessing the result of something she could not fully explain, because Luna was sitting up slightly, supported by her own strength for the first time in days, and the dog was still there, pressed close, steady as ever, as if nothing else in the world mattered. And when Emily approached slowly, speaking softly as she had the day before, the dog did not block her this time. It simply stayed beside Luna, allowing the moment to unfold, and Luna responded again, accepting more nourishment, her movements still careful but no longer hesitant, and with each small success, the weight of what had almost happened became clearer, because less than 72 hours earlier, they had been preparing to let her go, quietly, without intervention, believing there was nothing left to be done, and now they were watching her return, step by fragile step, guided not by equipment, not by procedures, but by something far simpler and far more powerful. And as the rest of the staff gathered again, their presence no longer uncertain but quietly supportive, Daniel found himself looking at the dog differently, no longer as a mystery to solve, but as a presence to respect, because whatever connection it carried, whatever history had brought it back here, it had changed the outcome in a way none of them could have predicted. And later that day, after careful discussion and quiet agreement, they made a decision that would have seemed impossible just one day before. They allowed the dog to stay, not as an exception, not as a risk, but as a part of Luna's recovery. And in the days that followed, that decision proved to matter more than anything else they could have done, because Luna continued to improve, slowly but steadily, her strength returning, her movements becoming more confident, her awareness growing clearer with each passing hour, and the dog never left her side, not once, remaining close through every moment, every small step forward, every quiet victory. And no one tried to separate them again, because by then, they all understood something they had